Welcome, everyone, to this March edition of SIG Talk for Quality and Testing, where we will talk about various tips and tricks to better your testing world. This is yet another wonderful presentation from our SIG Talk webinar platform. Listen and look forward to each and every month for a SIG Talk on testing, and as well as a new one starting up this week on operations. Look forward to that through the Vivit website for more event information. I am your host, Chris Trimper. I happen to be also the education chair on the Vivit board, a longtime test automation author, as well as a local user group leader in the Western New York area, and just love everything about test automation. Today's speakers, we have the local user group leader from Florida, Bob Cruz, who's the president of Checkpoint Technologies, the company is a Micro Focus former HP partner for over 15 years. He brings us over 28 years of IT experience in lifecycle development, including development, requirement management, and testing. He's a certified instructor for Mercury and has been doing or involved in test automation since the late 90s, so he brings a world of experience to us today. Also joining us is Karsten Misa. He's a senior IT quality consultant for Profi.com, and he's also our Germany chapter leader. He has over 5 years of experience in software development and software testing, and he likes to focus on test design completing with test automation tools. Karsten's passion is with model-based testing. So a few housekeeping things before we get into the real meat and potatoes of our session today. This is a live webinar. The upper right corner, you'll see a little box that will allow you to make the presentation bigger if you desire. All these recordings are available after the fact to all the Vivit members. And another great feature with the SIG Talks is we actually splice up the videos into small segments so you can watch over and over your favorite video as you go through. Our webinar control panel, off to the side, you'll see a question and answer pane for sessions. And depending on the country of your origin, you can choose a different language, so the questions will come to us in the right language so that we can understand your questions to their fullest. So feel free to ask questions throughout the session over there, and we'll get to them accordingly, and we'll certainly have time at the end for the questions. Another option, if you're coming to us from a mobile platform and maybe can't ask questions through my webinar place, is you can also tweet to Vivit SIG Talks, and we'll be monitoring that throughout the session to see your questions and have some great conversation. So to kick this off, I'd like to turn over to Bob Cruz. So Bob, kick us off, and let's get started on this fantastic topic. Thank you.
All right. Chris, thank you so much for that introduction. And I also want to thank you and the entire Vivit team for inviting me to speak today. I really appreciate it, and I'm thrilled to be speaking with Karsten as well. So today's topic that I'm going to discuss with you, I'm going to provide 7 tips for implementing a reliable framework design. So the learning objectives that I want to discuss today is hopefully after this short presentation, because I'm only going to take about 20 minutes, and then we'll be providing some questions and some Q&A. But I want to go over the fundamentals of a successful automation framework, the value of an automation framework. So what are the benefits, especially relative to DevOps and CI/CD? And then I'm going to share with you 7 very specific tips to design and implement an automation framework in a DevOps or a CI/CD environment. So when you think about it, a well-designed framework, what does that, what are the benefits exactly? Well, it decreases the automated test development time significantly. It also enables tests to be created sooner. So one of the fantastic things about an automation framework, a robust automation framework, is that it actually allows you to start creating automated tests even before the UI is developed. So as long as you've got collaboration with development and you understand and know the description of an object and the functionality, you can actually start creating your automated test, again, before the UI is ever developed. So that's incredible. It decreases maintenance. It increases test automation coverage. So in other words, by coverage, what I mean is you are going to be able to validate a significantly greater number of conditions, scenarios, requirements, etc. And then the last bullet, you don't want to take this benefit lightly. It puts the power of automation in more hands. So one of the great things is that you've got this automation engine in the background that perhaps your automation engineers have developed, but then you've got your SMEs, your SMEs, your subject matter experts that can actually develop the automated test using the front end. So those that are less technical, and I don't mean that in a negative way, can actually start creating automated tests. So the characteristics of a robust automation framework. It's got to have modular code. So there should be no duplication of code, nothing redundant. It's got to be scalable. Face it, I mean, let me ask all of you, how many of you know of an organization or in an organization where you've only got one application to test, to validate? I would be absolutely shocked if any of you were there virtually raising your hand. So it's got to be scalable. Little effort should be required to add business processes or new applications under test to the framework. It must address error handling. So all unexpected application errors are managed by using exception handlers. It's got to be reliable, and the data must be separated from the code. It's got to be managed externally. So these are all some key characteristics of a robust automation framework. So some common elements that I want to discuss. And we're just going to go over the fundamental components quickly, and then we'll dive into more detailed descriptions afterwards, and then I'll get into the design tips. But it's got to have a simple front end. So that is one of the common elements. And you'll notice in the visual here, if that looks like an Excel spreadsheet, it's because that's exactly what it is. So that's how simple the front end can be, and that provides benefits. It decreases the learning curve. A second element, as well as the sub-elements, if you will, is a maintainable back end. So the back end would be made up of a master driver, application drivers, and business process drivers. And I'm not going to really talk about actions, but keep in mind that there are more granular actions involved in your framework, but I'm not including those really as an element. And then the third element is the data. So the data which is actually entered into that simple front end, input data, validation data, etc. So the front end. So you can certainly utilize something other than a spreadsheet, but something that our organization has done quite successfully for many firms is we've implemented a robust framework using Microsoft Excel as the front end. So in this diagram that you see here, each column represents a test step. So you'll notice, for example, that the click register button, each cell would represent a step in the iteration of that instance where it would either check or uncheck that register button. Each record in our spreadsheet represents a test iteration. Each tab represents a business process. So you'll see that we've got our application under test login. So that login sheet represents the business process, obviously, of logging in. So as you can see, very intuitive. The AUT registration would be exactly that. Each business process tab contains all of the necessary parameters to create both positive and negative test. So very robust. And then output is captured to output parameters. So you would have columns in your spreadsheet defined as output parameters, and you can use output parameters to write values and customize your reports, or even much more likely, to utilize those values written in subsequent iterations. So the great benefit of such a framework and such a front end is that multiple applications under test can be incorporated simply by adding tabs associated with other AUTs. So perhaps we've got a new process coming down the road where it's going to be drop class. Then all we would have to do is add a tab, which would, again, represent a business process, for that drop class functionality. In the front end, a master Excel template contains all the business processes for a given application. To create a new test, a tester would simply save the master template as another file, remove the tabs not required for the test, and reorder in the order they will execute, then they apply the data. So the key thing here, the only minor challenge, is just make sure that you keep your master template pristine, maybe even keep it under lock and key. So let me share with you an example of the data flow relative to the front end and our drivers, the back end. So we've got our input file. So you'll notice there we've got our business process tabs, we've got our columns, we've got our different rows. And this file would then get fed in, if you will, into our master driver. And then that master driver would then ask, well, which file do I process? And it would process those passed in either by the master driver, or if you're utilizing Micro Focus's ALM or Quality Center, then you would define the input files in that solution. Then the application, the master driver, would then ask, well, which app driver do I call? Well, it would call this one. So notice that I'm pointing to AUT. So in our master driver, there would be logic or code, if you will, that would evaluate the business process tab name and utilize that to determine which application driver gets called. Then the application driver will say, well, which business process driver do I call? Well, this one, the login, because again, it's evaluating, the logic is evaluating the name of the business process tab. The driver would then ask, well, which action do I call to compare results? So perhaps we get to a point in our business process driver and the logic there where there's actually, it's going to grab the actual results and it wants to now compare it to the defined expected results. Which action does it call to do that comparison? Well, perhaps we have logic in our code which determines that if a column is preceded or has a naming convention of expected underscore, it knows to call our function or our action of compare. So a few framework design tips that I want to share with you. So this applies to your entire framework. It is critical that you know your users. Understand your audience, the customer, those that will be using the framework. Are they technical enough to understand objects, as well as classes and methods? So these are some questions that you've got to determine. If not, then you need to expect and build into the process, into your schedule, time to train them on the different concepts in order for them to be able to use the framework. You want to design it to handle everything in the background. When it comes to your users, do they understand test automation methodology? Or you might even ask, should they have to in order to use our framework? Can they be trained on how to use the framework to create automated tests in 8 hours or less? That's just a great, rule of thumb that we typically utilize. It's very beneficial to use an input method that everyone in your audience understands. So as I mentioned, that's why we tend to use Excel a lot, but you can certainly use an XML file. You can use a database input as well. Tip number 2, make sure that you document and communicate all standards. So the rules or the syntax required to create the automated test, those need to be easily understood and conveyed. Because if the learning curve is too difficult, it will go by the wayside, and we all know what happens then. It becomes shelfware. So remember, multiple applications and even multiple platforms must be taken into consideration. I've been in IT for 29 years, so I can absolutely remember the days back when I was an IBM DB2 COBOL programmer, and all I had to worry about were green screens.
Out again, I just was asking where we are currently right now. So I was just redialed.
Sure. I was going to see if Bob can come back in. So while we're waiting for Bob, we'll give him a moment. I was wondering if you could share a tip on, something with test automation frameworks to kind of tie into his content that helps to decrease maintenance. We know that frameworks, boast for modularity, a lot of avoiding redundancy, keeping things separate out. So I was hoping you had like a tip that you could share about keeping maintenance low with frameworks.
Yeah, as far as I see it now, what you should really define are input criteria, again, to check are the data which I am using already in the database, or do I have to maybe with UFT, with AP testing, to plug in my database, or Excel, whatever tool you're using, and also define some output criteria. So something like that, generally spoken.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting how with testing and test automation, we don't realize it's just an extension of development, and having those requirements are incredibly important.
Be great.
Sure, just give us that little ding like from the 1985 slideshows, and we'll be good.
Okay, all right.
So you're on the slide for framework design tips.
All right, give me 1 second, and I'm going to get the slides up here if I can.
I'll give a silly ad lib while we're waiting for that. I think it's phenomenal that Bob knows his users so well that he knows three of the Beatles personally based on his users.
That's right, and I usually ask people if they can guess what the WMGGW, which song that stands for. Do you know that one, Chris?
If you didn't have me live, I probably would.
See, and that one is While My Guitar Gently Weeps. And I am having a tough time, guys, getting, wait a second, bear with me, tips, right, Chris?
Framework design tips. Know your users, document and communicate standards.
Fantastic. Okay, yeah. So absolutely, you want to know the rules or syntax required to create the automated tests. They need to be easily understood and conveyed. And the other great thing is when you hire new folks and they're trying to learn your framework as well as the automation processes, that's going to make it so much easier. And then make sure that you know the scope and expectation of automation within your organization with the leadership. Because if it's designed solely to work on web apps using IE, well, what about cross-browser testing? What about SAP or Oracle or some other ERP system? And what about legacy apps that might use VB and ActiveX, things like that? So it is absolutely essential that you know the scope and expectations of leadership within your organization. So on the next slide, I'm going to target specifically a couple of front-end and data design tips. So as I've mentioned a couple of times already, use a common tool for data input. Excel is fantastic, but you have some other options. And you want to make sure, by the way, that you design the front end prior to the back end. Because as I mentioned, you're going to ask yourself who will be tasked with using the framework to design the automated test. And another thing I've learned the hard way, don't assume that the users are experts in Excel. Don't take that for granted. In what format will the test be designed? You want to make sure that you utilize input, output, decision, and verification parameters. Also, incorporate
simple keywords, such as clear if the functionality is supposed to clear the content of a field, or maybe today plus 30 if you want to enter a date 30 days in the future. So these are all things. Make sure you incorporate simple keywords, much easier to learn, much easier to maintain. The last two, tips 6 and 7, on the back-end design on the next slide, make sure that you build the back-end to support the front end. Ask yourself, how does the data get fed into the framework? How does runtime data get captured and reused? How are multiple iterations handled? So these are all things that you want to ask yourself as you are designing the back end in order to support the front end. And then last, use good common sense coding best practices. Make sure that your engine, your drivers are all very modular in design. Make sure that they're well documented within the code itself. Ensure that your reporting is detailed, clear, and concise, maybe even getting screenshots if possible as objective evidence. So these are just 7 tips that I want to share with you. In the next slide, applying your framework, you want to initially start with getting to CI and continuous delivery. Start with automation of unit test. Automate your deployments to the stage environment as soon as possible. Another thing that you want to do is configure your continuous integration system to launch all tests based on an appropriate event. So that event might be a build, might be a deployment, or it might be a specific time on a clock. And once you get to the point where you are releasing software on a daily basis, that's when you might be ready to look into continuous deployment, but make sure that the rest of your organization is ready as well. So I'm talking about documentation, support, marketing, because these functions will need to adapt to the new cadence of releases. And it's very important that they do not miss on significant changes that can impact customers. So that is it. And again, I apologize to everybody for that delay and really appreciate you sticking with us. But here's my contact information. Please feel free to contact me anytime with any questions, any thoughts. And with that being said, I am going to turn it over to Karsten for what I'm sure will be an interruption-free presentation. So take it away, Karsten.
So thank you very much, Bob, for this amazing talk. I think now we have a very good overview about setting up a framework, a general framework. Now we come to the tools. This is maybe a good point going to the tools. So I want to, sorry for HPE, there should be a micro focus, about some clarification about using UFT, micro focus, and LeanFT. Some words about my person. I'm senior consultant at Profi.com. I'm local chapter in Germany since maybe now almost 2.5 years. And I set up some kind of regional meetings and webinars also in the German region. So if you want to also to get to know what's happening in Germany, you're kindly invited to look our webinars. What I want to go to talk about is some general shift versus shift right. This is when we see the tools in front. There's a high discussion. Then I will talk about some installation tips and tricks, some tips about object identification, what you can use, because if you're operating on the GUI, it might occur that you cannot every time can detect all the objects you want to have. AP testing, what's the difference in both tools? What about BPT? And the last point would be the execution of tests from traditional ALM work, or maybe in a CI/CD pipeline from Jenkins. I wanted we wanted first of all to have a short survey about what kind of tools you're using. I would maybe delegate to Chris about starting this survey, and you could read it, I guess.
Yeah,
or shall I read it?
If we just ask everyone to take a moment, look at this survey, we're looking to figure out what test approach you would say is most used in your company for the tooling set. So we'll give about a minute for folks to vote in here, and then we can go over those results. Since I can't vote, we are UFT, both GUI and API, and investigating where LeanFT fits for us, and certainly adopters of StormRunner functional.
Or even if you are using manual testing, that's very interesting. Some customers still use a lot of manual testing.
Oh, we have an immense amount of manual testing too. In fact, for us, we have our manual testing. I mean, without manual testing, we wouldn't have a direction for our automation. So it certainly is an area that we have an awful lot of. So give another like 15, 20 seconds to get people to vote in here, and then we can go through the results. All right, so the results that we have here is the large two pies that are almost identical are at the top UFT with GUI and API. Second to that, manual testing, and that comprises about, say, 65+% of everyone. Next is GUI only, and then falling behind that is other, so manual testing, etc. No, wait, I'm hovering over it wrong. My apologies. It's StormRunner functional, and then in the tail is LeanFT. So it looks like LeanFT adoption is kind of a little behind potentially. So those are your results in order: other, manual testing, etc. UFT with GUI API, UFT GUI only, StormRunner functional, and LeanFT in the tail.
Yeah, thanks, Bob, for this survey. Sounds really nice. Also very nice that already 3 people are using a StormRunner functional. That's quite amazing. And LeanFT only 1. So, but what we do also see is a lot of things are still done manually also. So that's also amazing. Yeah, in the first talk we had about the general things of framework. So what you should consider in those 2 tools is not that LeanFT is the of UFT. So one tool is for the shift left. This is for sure LeanFT, though it's unit test, it's behavior driven. It's for behavior driven tests. Yeah, it's completely close to the development. And the purpose of UFT is more to some kind of integration test, system test, so it's more to the shift right. So use UFT that.
Let's take a minute and talk a little bit more about those survey results while we wait for Karsten. Karsten, just shout whenever you're back.
No, that sounds great.
So what do you think about those survey results? So I certainly feel like it's definitely showing the trend. But you know, we got the top 2 at UFT solely. Well, actually UFT with GUI and API, which I was thrilled to see so many folks using UFT in, I guess, what I call mixed mode for both UFT and API as opposed to just all UI. What are some of your thoughts on those survey results?
So that actually was surprising to me as well to a certain degree. I have noticed a significant increase in the past year and a half in regard to API testing, which I think is fantastic. And I love that so many organizations are utilizing the API testing functionality in UFT. The other thing I thought that they really showed is that more and more organizations are really following the shift left paradigm and, you know, getting their developers and their more technical folks involved in quality, which I just absolutely love to see.
I think there's another shift going on that I would encourage Micro Focus to coin, and that's the shifting up where we're going up
Yes.
into the cloud with StormRunner functional, and the trust of putting more testing into the cloud. That's certainly a big thing. Back to your thoughts on API. API is a phenomenal thing to use. We use it here a lot for not only just testing APIs, but a really great way to do a UI test validation of something actually happened. You're registering something. We'll use the lovely flights demo app. You're registering for a flight, and you want to validate that flight got registered. Do you want to go through a weighty UI to do that, or do you want to do it through an API? I would love to do it through the API and add a lot of efficiency to my testing.
Yep, that makes perfect sense.
Back again, sorry for being dropped out. So
no worries. We had a chance to talk a little bit more about the survey results, so we are ready for you to get back into talking about, we're on slide 26 with UFT and LeanFT in terms of the tooling. So Carsten, back to you, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. So consider that for installation for UFT, you need admin rights and local installation. So it comes out that on large companies, it would be sensible to packagize the UFT so that making the deployment of that is really more easy. It's supporting only Windows up to now. That's a difference to LeanFT. And if you want to use the demo tools, consider about the add-ins. So in UFT, a lot of add-ins are choosable. And if you want to use this demo flight app or something else of these apps, consider that all of the add-ins, at least the VPF or WPF add-in is installed if you want to do some teaching stuff inside your company. If you're doing test automation, it really comes out that at some point UFT is crashing, tests are crashing. For logging purposes, use the ALM client log wrapper. So it really helps, especially in analyzing the BPT runs. Also use the QC Sense. This is very helpful. Add-in of the HPE ALM if you're really doing debugging and so on. Let's call it UFT as a standalone installation. LeanFT is really completely different. So it's an add-on on Visual Studio or Eclipse, and even in your version, they support now IntelliJ. So you need some kind of IDE in your environment, but the advantage here is that you have it on different operating systems like Windows or even Linux. But you need some Visual Studio or something like that. If you build up a really test framework for nightly build testing, it's really the tool of choice for using NUnit, JUnit, TestNG, really to deploy your unit tests also, and you can use the runtime engine in whatever CI/CD engine you are using. Object identification is really sometimes a robust thing, especially if you develop your own code, your own classes. It turns out that the object storage is different in both worlds. So in UFT, all of you know it, maybe you use the object repository, which is storing your information about the graphical stuff in an XML file. In general, don't grow up those object files too large. Even if you're working with HPC, remember that for every execution, for every code changing, the object repository has to be transferred from the HPQC to the UFT. And that's how it has to be loaded. It makes execution slower. Sometimes, if you don't come around in UFT with the usual object and identification, use the native properties to extend the identification. It really helps a lot for that, but for that you have really to write your own libraries and so on. What is really helping is our regular expressions using parameters in the object repository inside the code, which is making more generalized code. Even we saw it in the talk before, even to extend your modules, which if you make some modular content of your test script, it's really helping about that. To become more faster, that's my experience. I would be interested in some other test automation people. Descriptive programming is helping for debugging. If you want to count some objects on your screen, if you want to count something else, some initializing time, and so on. And it's helping to become faster in your code. That was my experience. So whenever you can, descriptive programming is really a good choice, but also using a repository to make more people work on that, it's also helping. So it's always pro and contra about that. LeanFT does not support as many as technologies like UFT. And there the modeling or the object identification is treated other than like in UFT. There you have an extra class. It's called application model, where you plug in all the all the objects you want to treat with, and they are treated inside objects inside the code. So it's more maybe like calling more like a descriptive programming. Yeah, that's the main difference between both worlds. API testing. API testing, I think, is since version 12 fine. Went to inside UFT, and we recommend. So if you're using large tests, be careful. UFT tends to become very imperformant, so very slow if you want to blow up a lot of tests. And be careful and security issues. So the OAuth token are not supported natively. So if you're using security stuff, keep an eye on that. But it's supporting a lot of technologies like MQ, like JMS, like SAP. So it's really a good way of API testing, REST, and so on. LeanFT does not support API testing, but you can handle it if you're using native libraries for web services or anything else. So maybe at the end we have some time who can share his knowledge or his ideas about LeanFT or experience LeanFT for MQ testing or anything else, or web service testing. Maybe someone did it in the audience. I would be interested in that. Yeah. Business process testing is maybe the most concept of micro focus. It is a very cool technology for building up, setting up a good framework. But be careful in the architecture of using DPT, because you should, when you set up, as it in the first talk was given, think about execution time, loading time. Everything has to be in your framework thought about. And business process or business component do load a lot of, or to need a time when starting during a test. And so it turns out that using business components tend to be slower using usual tests. I know some customers who went back from business process testing because they said it's too slow for us. So keep an eye on that. If you set up in framework in execution time, every component has to be compiled on your system. So there are several things what you should think about. Be careful when set up with the application areas. Don't change too much if you generalize or put everything in one and don't use different add-ins for a test. Nothing has to be loaded every time you start a next component. This fastens your test execution. Yeah, and like in every test automation, keep an eye on robustness rather than performance, because it has to be you have to be sure that a test will run through all the components, through all the test results. Then to be faster, maybe you can parallelize your execution and then fasten it up. LeanFT, on the other side, also treats some components. They are called LeanFT components. You can also deal them in the ALM right now, but they cannot be mixed with other types of business process testing. This you should keep in mind. So you cannot mix components of LeanFT and UFT. So this is up to now not possible. I'm not sure about the roadmap. And like in UFT, best practice for those kind of components, use small tests and use short runtimes to have a good overview. You have the possibility to execute the tests on several things. So for UFT tests, you can store the complete test on the ALM. Then you would have to do this, the test execution, to do it manually. What you could do else is you could use ALM plus lab extension, on which you automatically start those kind of tests. Challenging at customer side is at every point that when you do test execution, screensaver is logged in. So this might be an issue that you log off the screensaver. It's really it's happening very often that tests do not run complete through because the screensaver is went on, and then the object identification does not work. So this you should consider on your machines where you install the UFT. And getting remote access to the target machine when you deploy your UFT test to several hosts is also a challenging competition at customers. You have to look in, to be very careful to make this working. So this is really very hard at a lot of customers. Let's call it like that UFT is very good supported for the execution on ALM and Octane. LeanFT is not so good supported because it's very new. What you do there, you produce some kind of artifact, some DLLs or jar files, and then you have to manually, or you have to import those files into your ALM. The first thing would you import it manually and define every kind of object of keys inside the ALM test execution. Where you have you define the test set and so on inside, and you do it manually. The second thing what you could use is you use an import tool from ALM to wrap around those kind of executables and test type and write your own handler for the results. This we do see also some kind at customer side. As I said in the beginning, LeanFT is for shift left. There's a natively support for Jenkins and so on. I do not want to go too much into detail on this, because I've seen it in the first talk about that. Yeah, and sure, on LeanFT you can run from Octane. So the last slide, what I wanted to present is that LeanFT and Selenium work really cool together. You can use LeanFT for the extent of the object
and LeanFT, and the fact that you can now integrate the two together. and it is natively supported with Java, especially if you have LeanFT with Eclipse. You can now integrate the two together pretty painlessly and generate files. Carsten, if you have a chance to dial back in, we'll let you have some closing thoughts on LeanFT and Selenium.
And Chris, this is Bob. If you don't mind me just kind of making a point on this slide, you know, it's very interesting the number of people that tend to forget that LeanFT is an excellent supplement solution to Selenium. I mean, so many people, you know, seem to be under the impression that LeanFT is meant as a competitive solution to Selenium, and it's really not. I mean, they go hand in hand. They each bring strengths. So I'm starting to encounter more organizations that have both solutions, and I love seeing that.
Yeah, actually a great point. With brand new with LeanFT or UFT Pro version 14.03, they rewrote the Object Identification Center, and there's a really nice feature in there whereby you can select multiple objects for identification at once. So if you're on a, let's say it's a comments page or a order page and there's 19 objects you want to learn, in the past, if you use the UI for object identification, whether it's in UFT or UFT Pro, LeanFT, any of those, you have to go one at a time. Here, you can kind of click a whole bunch of them together, and then you were able to adopt those into your test pretty instantaneously. It's pretty slick. I had a chance to try that out the other day. So they certainly are continuing to push those bounds and make it so, you know, an example would be with Selenium WebDriver, there isn't the notion of that component. And you're right, they're really good complements to each other. So we have some time for some questions. I wanted to point out one question that Carsten had, and that was with API tests. You can actually take a UFT API test and integrate it with LeanFT. If you go to the ADM Help Center, go to UFT Pro, and search under that documentation for API tests under LeanFT, it does talk about the necessary libraries to bring in to do it and how to make the call to your API test. So Carsten, were we able to bring you back in because we had some questions about your content? We'll try to go through these anyways. So there's one question, and Carsten, if you're able to come back on, let us know, and if not, Bob. There's mention of being able to package UFT for installation for larger companies. Is there a particular tool that you guys have had success with in the past to do that? That you can share, or maybe something we can follow up with users for that?
And my apologies on that one, Chris. That is something I'm not, is a bit out of my area of expertise. So that is definitely something for Carsten. But I know that if folks... Carsten's
sorry,
back.
I was drop out again. Sorry, I don't know when I was dropped out. So what kind of slide, or where are you now? So I didn't hear for a while.
Just the Selenium piece, and actually, if you didn't mind, Bob closed it out nicely, talking about the nice complement of LeanFT and Selenium. So if you had any other notes you wanted to share on this, please feel free to do that at this time.
No, I wanted to emphasize, like, it's written just because it's a matter of time.
Broke up.
Sounds like we might lose them again. Yeah.
I think we did. So for those folks asking about how to package UFT and for installation, we will answer that back. That's something that Carsten would have notes on. Let's try a couple of these. So is there do we know if there's going to be an integration with Java Selenium with LoadRunner? At least it was asked with LoadRunner 12.5.5. I'm going to kind of guess no at the moment. But Bob, have you heard anything about if Selenium and LoadRunner will ever meet up?
I have heard rumors that they are working on that enhancement. I've not heard anything as far as any kind of a target release date or anything, Chris.
Yeah, I guess I would just keep on, checking in with Micro Focus. They've been seeming to do quite quite a few events all around the globe. So if there's an event coming near to you, feel free to stop in and ask the folks and just push for it. Here, and I'm sure with you too, Bob, they've been pretty tremendous with getting customer feedback. So, if enough people are asking for it, I think you're going to certainly see that.
Absolutely.
Sorry for being away again. So,
sure.
More questions? What do you have?
One question was if there was a piece of software or tool that you use to package UFT for installation in a corporation.
No standard Microsoft utilities.
Okay, and I'm assuming using the command line arguments to package it and with the options and such.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Have either of you run into, there's a question that I'll just read it verbatim and hopefully you guys can spark what it means. Have either of you had input regarding maintenance? I think this is more in terms of maintenance to things because it certainly is a big issue in regarding test automation. So have you had a chance to be part of maintenance, considering we'd love to be in a world where test first is a method, but it isn't always?
So I'll dive right in on that one if you don't mind. So from a solution perspective, specific to UFT, I mean, one of the things that we and our engineers always highly recommend is to utilize descriptive programming, which is going to, increase the functionality or ability for UFT to identify objects during runtime. The other thing from a process point of view that I always try to emphasize is to implement a very collaborative process with your developers so that you can be more proactive in having to redefine perhaps objects and therefore change your scripts or change the object repository and how objects are defined. But, having that collaboration with your development team and knowing beforehand when something is going to change definitely gives you a jump on that and makes maintenance much easier. So, yeah, Carson, I don't know if you have anything to add. Yeah.
That's obviously very helpful as we're going more for a shift left mentality because, we're embracing ourselves in that development world and we want to have as close a communication with them as possible.
Definitely.
Carson, do you have anything to add on that note?
No, I absolutely agree with Bob.
Okay. I think we have time for one last question, and this would be if you have any tips or approaches for an individual that has been using the tools without really a framework in mind and realizing that they want to grow and turn what they have into a framework or to evolve a framework out of it. Maybe they're at that next step in their test automation. Do you have any a quick thought from each of you on where to start or what's a good tip or trick for that?
So the tip that I would provide, I actually mentioned during my presentation, Chris, start with unit testing. I mean, that's a great place to start. If your goal is to get an automation framework in place specifically in a CI/CD environment, or even with the ultimate goal being DevOps. So start with unit testing.
Great. Something from you, Karsten?
No, not really. Just from the beginning, just to have it, because I think in a company it's important to have quick results. If you start with a framework from scratch, it takes some time. I think, so Bob, I don't know what your experience is, but maybe we speak in a time span from years to really think about a cool framework working, but you cannot wait 1 or 2 years until you have results. So you should start with very short test scripts where you just record and replay, and then it has to grow up. So you have to have 2 ways to implement a framework.
Fantastic point, Carson. I agree 100%. I mean, let your framework evolve, but in the meantime, you've got to be getting some benefit out of test automation. So you make a great point there. Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. And something I'd like to add that to reiterate off something you were talking about, Bob, another great thing is to get your inputs first. Getting your inputs first are very big because that's really where you're going to have your basis of everything. It's fantastic. I just want to follow up on one thing. There was a note on whether or not Selenium is supported. If you look at the load runner help, there is description on including a well, they're calling it a unit test, but a JUnit or Selenium test in your load runner. So just give a search in the help for Selenium, and you should be able to find that article. Somewhere in the 12.5s, someone just wrote in 12.5.3 and higher, there was support for that. To what degree, I'm not 100% sure. I have not used it personally, but it is certainly in there as a documented feature.
JMeter is supported, but I'm not sure about Selenium. Okay.
So yeah, JMeter as well, for sure. And a really great note that we're seeing a lot of adoption of more tooling to be integrated in with the Micro Focus tools. So any closing notes from the two of you as we're getting ready to ramp down today's session?
No, thank you, so much, Chris and Terry and the whole Vivit team for putting this together today. I again, on my behalf, I apologize for the being disconnected there, but I welcome everybody and anybody to email me any questions that you might have. I obviously love this topic very much. So thank you again, and thank you to the audience for joining us.
All right, we'd like to focus on two upcoming webinars. This week, SIG Talk for IT Operations. This is the launch of the Operation SIG Talk. We'll have ITSMA Hybrid Cloud Management, and then toward the tail end of the month, accelerating high-quality app delivery with DevOps Suite. So at the end, there'll be a short survey. And again, thank you, Carson, so much for joining us today, and Bob. We had a great topic and really can't wait to hear more from the two of you. So I hope everybody has a fantastic day, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.